I suppose it was a natural thing for me to have this thought when my little granddaughter Katie took my hand and brought me to the chancel area. And the thought was this, that when I came here, my oldest son was younger than Katie when we first arrived on the scene. And the years have passed. How about James and John? For most of you who know the biblical story, James and John need no introduction. They were among the first fishermen called by Jesus, "Come, follow me." In the key events of the ministry of Jesus, James and John were always present. Also, Peter. It was always Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John, in that order. They are the key three. Evidently, James and John were somewhat temperamental, and by that I mean they had tempers. They were called the sons of thunder. That was their nickname among the disciples, among others in the village of Capernaum. The sons of thunder. Such were their tempers. Yet Jesus called them, "Come, follow me." If you've ever wondered if Jesus had a sense of humor, I'd say that yes, he did. Look at that ragtag collection of disciples whom he himself had chosen. Only 12. On the face of the earth, Jesus had only 12 close disciples. A lot of hangers-on, a lot of the crowds followed him for a while, but only an inner circle. 12. And 1/6 of that 12, James and John, foul-tempered fishermen called to be disciples. Take James and John, 2 of the 12. Take Peter. Peter, on the night before Jesus was arrested, Peter claimed to the effect, "I don't know Jesus from Adam." Take Judas, please. I wonder if Jesus ever second-guessed himself. He had just told the disciples in the verse before this text, he had told his disciples, James and John were present, that he was going to Jerusalem. And within minutes of announcing, "They will mock me and spit on me and flog me and kill me, and after 3 days I will rise again." After telling the disciples for the umpteenth time what was going to happen in Jerusalem, James and John sidle up to Jesus with a humble request. "Jesus, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." It's like politics, I suppose, the world over. If you support a winning candidate, you expect to be rewarded for your efforts. Going far back in history, those in power usually had long coattails. And always people yearned to ride those coattails to places of prominence. The robe of Jesus was not that long. Nevertheless, James and John wanted to grab hold of the coattails of that robe. So this is nothing new, not in politics, also in the realm of religion. Believe me, it happens in church settings too. If my friend Marvin were bishop, I'd want to be assigned to a large and prominent parish, except for the fact that I'm already at one. Coattails. Coattails were the request of James and John. "Jesus, when you come into your glory, we want places of prominence in your cabinet." And this request of James and John is problematic in all kinds of ways, but one issue is this. The other disciples, the other 10, there's only 12, the other 10 get their noses out of joint at the request of James and John. Maybe the other 10 were thinking to themselves, "We should have gotten there first." But maybe they just thought that it was not quite the right thing to say to Jesus just after he had said he was going to die. the little band of disciples. We might call them the community of Jesus and the 12. And they become divided due to the arrogance and the egos of James and John. We are all aware that communities which fail to work together can often fall apart. And think of that community, only 12 plus Jesus. That's why James and John are so off base when they jockey for positions of prominence. Throughout the 51 years of her history, members of this community of grace have done great things as we grew from the smallest church in our synod to one of the largest. Grace has become a parish of prominence. In all humility, I've often remarked that we have the tallest steeple in all of Gomer Street. And you might wonder how this came to be. Well, throughout the 51 years of grace, we have been blessed with fine leadership, Sunday school teachers and staff, passing the baton of faith to countless students. All of those children up here this morning. This might or might not be a day they remember, but it's a part of a process of growing in the Christian faith. Music directors and choir members adding harmony to our worship experience. We are known in this community of Yorktown Mahopac, and we are known because of our efforts at reaching out and touching those beyond our walls. Not only the local community, but far off Tanzania, for instance. Palestine with blankets to keep the people warm. It is important that our facility and grounds are attractive to our neighbors. We want God's house to be just as nice as our own homes. And we have scores of people doing the maintaining, both inside and out. We have had congregation presidents, perhaps 15 over the course of 51 years. Congregation presidents providing the leadership here that we so sorely need, and good leadership. And along with members of congregation councils over the years, they have kept us fiscally strong. They have given their time freely in planning for both the present and the future. There are finance people, those who count the offerings, those who attend our altar, those worship leaders and greeters and ushers. Over the years, there have been thousands of people faithful in worship and supporting this congregation so generously. This community of Christ in various and sundry ways have been so richly supported. In the old days, we used to call them the pillars of the church. We know what that means. Those who take seriously what it means to be a member of the body of Christ. We've lost, in the last 10 months, 10 members of this congregation, all of them pillars of the church in their own way. We are very fortunate to have had the saints among us, these saints among us. There have been only 4 pastors serving grace in 51 years. Each of us has been part of another community also. We have been supported, all 4 of us, by the members of this wonderful congregation. But we have had a very small community, which we might call the community of the parsonage. And I can only speak on behalf of the 4th pastor, who happens to be me, as I say that my family has been such a strong support to me personally, and all have been active participants in the life of this congregation. My daughter Sarah, who can't be with us this morning, she's down in Savannah. She will be here next week. She gave me a call this morning saying, "Dad, I'm thinking about you." One of Martin Luther's greatest achievements in terms of the Reformation was his realization that family life can be a wonderful joy for the pastor, a break from the day-to-day challenges of pastoral ministry, someone's to come home to. This former priest, Father Martin, fell in love with a former nun, Catherine von Bora, and Martin took her hand in marriage. And thus began the community of the parsonage. And most pastors have been blessed, and I have, in such a community ever since. Some years ago, and people of a certain age will remember the name Norman Vincent Peale. He was a man who needed no introduction. He was a guest preacher one Sunday at the Crystal Cathedral in California, where Dr. Robert Schuller was the pastor. Back in the day, Norman Vincent Peale, again, was a man who needed no introduction. Nevertheless, Robert Schuller felt the need to say something about Dr. Peale, and he did. He said, "I want to introduce you to the most dynamic person you will ever meet in your life. He is exciting, positive. What a preacher. He can reach down into your hearts more deeply than anybody else that you have ever known. He will give you self-confidence. He will give you courage and a whole lot of other things you have always wanted in your life, but have not had." Now you could almost envision Dr. Peale squirming in his chair. How was he going to respond to an introduction like that? How could he possibly respond? As he was trying to think of something to say, he heard Dr. Schuller continue, "The person of whom I am speaking, of course, is Jesus Christ. And here to tell you about him is my friend, Dr. Norman Vincent Peale." And Robert Schuller certainly had a sense of humor. And Jesus does too, a sense of humor. How else can you explain the fact that he called me to be a pastor? And I say that with no false humility. And for 38 years, I've been privileged to tell you about Jesus. That's who we're here to honor this morning, every Sunday, every morning. Jesus Christ, the true shepherd of the sheep. What a sense of humor. Tim Kennedy. Ironically, I have the sense that the people of grace through the years have taught me about Jesus more so than I've ever been privileged to try to teach you. I've learned so much about God's love, so much about the grace of God by the way you have accepted me and my family over these years. And maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. Maybe God knows I needed 1,000 preachers in my life, and God has provided them and had the people of grace preaching to me in so many wondrous ways, not with words. You've heard that story that the best sermons are those preached without using words. We've got some wonderful preachers among you teaching me about the grace and forgiveness of God. Again, I don't say this with any false sense of humility. Maybe sometimes people have thought that I have the ego of a James or a John. It's a given that good leaders need strong egos. And I'm not necessarily saying I'm a good leader, but I do have a strong ego. But this is the truth. I've wondered why God's grace was so prevalent in my life. I really feel unworthy to even be standing here. And it's the truth. I'm a shy sort of a guy. I really am. And to think that God called me to share such wonderful good news, I've been gifted by grace. God's grace and the grace of this congregation. Hopefully, I've been perceived as a pastor who sought to serve rather than to be served. I retire October 31st, 55 years to the day when 15-year-old Timmy Kennedy prayed to God for direction in his life. I did a scientific experience. I took my Bible from the nightstand. I closed my eyes. I riffled the pages just like this. I stuck in my finger, landed right on Matthew 28:19. Go into all the world and baptize in the name... Oh, I remember the name. In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Right in the center of that verse, Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. I felt it was to be my direction in life. Follow Jesus and share him with all nations. Can you imagine? All nations. How successful was I? Am I? Let me tell you this. The very next day, November 1st, 1960, I did what I always did after school. I got on my bicycle and delivered the local newspaper, the Lorain Journal. Some of my customers lived in Sheffield Lake, Ohio, and they lived on U.S. Route 6. Make disciples of all nations, Jesus says. Now, 55 years later, I conclude my career 515 miles to the east, a block from U.S. Route 6, the very same Route 6. Disciples of all nations, indeed. Thanks to the generosity of grace, 25 years ago, I graduated from our seminary in Philadelphia with the degree Doctor of Ministry. Some 50 members of Grace made the trip to Philly to help me celebrate. My mother was there also. She said to me, Tim, I always wanted to say, my son, the doctor. We had a big banquet the night before, and somebody gave me the Dr. Seuss book, Oh, the Places You'll Go. That's a great book for any graduate. You have brains in your head, you have feet in your shoes, you can steer yourself any direction you choose. All nations. Oh, the places I've gone in my working career. Paperboy to pastor of Grace, a journey 515 miles east on U.S. Route 6. And I thank God for that journey. And how about this for a P.S.? Nell and I are purchasing a condo in Carmel, 13 miles northeast, just off, you guessed it, U.S. Route 6. So I close this final sermon at Grace with words by singer-songwriter Michael W. Smith. Here is where the road divides. Here is where we realize the sculptor of the Father's great design. Through time, you've been a friend of mine, but time is now the enemy. I wish we did not have to say goodbye. Okay, who had 13 minutes into the sermon? But I know the road he chose for me is not the road he chose for you. Pray for me, and I'll pray for you. Memories will be our souvenirs, and I know that through it all, the hardest part of love is letting go. But there's a greater love that holds us. Pray for me, and I'll pray for you. Janes and Jeans and James and Johns among us, you who are the community of saints here at Grace, pray for me, and I'll pray for you. Amen. I don't even have to ask you to stand for the next hymn.